The ballroom slowly filled with laughter, music, and the sound of champagne glasses clinking together while guests settled into their seats for the reception dinner. A massive chandelier glowed above the dance floor, reflecting light across the expensive decorations Vanessa had spent months obsessing over. Waiters moved perfectly between tables serving gourmet dishes, while photographers captured every glamorous moment for social media. From the outside, the evening looked flawless. At our table, Helen sat quietly staring down at her untouched plate, trying her best not to cry again. I could tell she was emotionally exhausted. Every insult throughout the day had slowly chipped away at her confidence until she no longer looked like herself. And what hurt me most was that Daniel noticed it too, yet still said nothing. The speeches began shortly after dinner was served. Vanessa's maid of honor gave a dramatic speech comparing the couple to royalty, while guests laughed and applauded on cue. Then Vanessa's father stood up holding a glass of expensive whiskey, smiling proudly as the room quieted for him. He talked endlessly about success, legacy, and how important it was to give your children the very best life possible. Several times he hinted at the enormous cost of the wedding, clearly enjoying the admiration in people's faces, as though he alone had built the entire event from the ground up. At one point he even joked, "When Vanessa wants a dream wedding, her father delivers." Guests laughed and applauded loudly. I looked over at Helen. She lowered her eyes and forced a small smile, even though I knew hearing those words hurt her deeply. Not because she cared about credit, but because the people taking credit had spent the entire day humiliating her. My wife had quietly sacrificed so much for this wedding without expecting recognition. Yet she was being treated like an unwanted guest, while others proudly claimed ownership of her generosity. Then Daniel stood up for his speech. For a moment, I honestly hoped he would finally say something meaningful about his mother. I hoped he would look at Helen and publicly thank her for the lifetime of sacrifices she made for him. I hoped he would defend her after everything that happened. Instead, he gave a safe speech filled with jokes about marriage and compliments toward Vanessa's family for welcoming him into their world. Their world. Not once did he mention the woman who spent decades building his world from nothing. I saw Helen's smile finally break. She quickly looked away, pretending to fix her napkin, but I saw the tears forming in her eyes. That was the final moment for me. Something inside my chest hardened completely. I realized if I stayed silent any longer, I would be helping them humiliate her too. As applause filled the ballroom, I slowly stood from my chair. At first, nobody paid much attention. Guests assumed I was simply heading toward the restroom or speaking with staff. But then I walked directly toward the stage where the microphone rested beside the wedding band. Rachel, the wedding planner, noticed immediately. Her eyes widened slightly because she understood before anyone else what was about to happen. Vanessa noticed me approaching, and her smile faded instantly. "Dad," Daniel said nervously into microphone, reached the stage calmly, smiled politely at the band leader, and gently took the microphone into my hand. The ballroom became quiet almost immediately. Hundreds of eyes turned toward me as soft confusion spread across the room. Vanessa looked uncomfortable already, while her father leaned back in his chair, expecting another harmless family toast. I looked directly at my wife first. Helen shook her head slightly, silently begging me not to do this. But I couldn't stay quiet anymore. Not after watching the woman I loved get treated like she was beneath everyone in that room. I cleared my throat slowly before speaking. I wasn't planning to give a speech tonight. I began calmly, but after everything I witnessed today, I think there are a few things people deserve to know. The room became completely silent. Vanessa shifted nervously in her seat, while Daniel's face turned pale almost instantly. I continued speaking carefully, keeping my voice calm despite the anger burning inside me. First, I'd like to talk about my wife. I turned toward Helen again. This woman spent her entire life sacrificing for her family. She worked exhausting hospital shifts, gave up vacations, sold family jewelry, and stood beside me through every difficult year imaginable so our son could have opportunities we never had growing up. Guests listened quietly now, no longer smiling. Everything Daniel became in life happened because his mother loved him unconditionally. Helen covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Then I slowly turned toward Vanessa and her family. "And yet today," I said firmly, I watched this incredible woman get treated as if she were embarrassing. You could feel the tension explode across the ballroom instantly. Guests exchanged shocked looks, while Vanessa's expression froze completely. Daniel looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. But I wasn't finished. Some people here seemed very proud of paying for this wedding. I continued. So I think it's only fair everyone knows the truth. Vanessa's father straightened in his chair immediately. I reached into my jacket pocket calmly and pulled out several folded payment documents Rachel had quietly printed for me earlier. The venue. I lifted one paper slightly. Paid by me. Another paper. The catering upgrades. Paid by me. Another. The honeymoon villa in Italy. Paid by me. The ballroom fell completely silent, except for distant music from outside the hall. The emergency $80,000 balance that saved this wedding yesterday morning. I looked directly at Vanessa's father. Also paid by me. The man's face lost all color instantly. Gasps spread across the room as guests looked between me and Vanessa's family in disbelief. Vanessa herself looked horrified, not because of the money, but because the image she spent months building was collapsing in front of everyone. And then I delivered the sentence that changed the entire night. The woman you called embarrassing today, I said while looking directly at Vanessa, is the reason this wedding even happened. For several seconds after I finished speaking, nobody moved. The ballroom felt frozen in place, as though the entire wedding had suddenly stopped breathing. Guests stared at me in complete shock, while the orchestra near the stage quietly lowered their instruments, unsure whether they were supposed to continue playing or disappear entirely. Vanessa sat motionless beside Daniel, her face drained of color, while her father looked like someone had publicly slapped him across the face. Every ounce of confidence he carried earlier had vanished, and at the center of it all sat my wife Helen, trembling quietly in her chair as tears rolled down her cheeks. I wasn't angry anymore at that point. I was calm, completely calm, and somehow that made the room even more uncomfortable. Vanessa recovered first. She forced out a nervous laugh and stood up quickly, trying desperately to regain control of the situation before whispers spread further across the ballroom. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," she said shakily while glancing around at the guests. "Of course we appreciate everything Daniel's parents contributed." "Contributed?" I interrupted calmly. The room went silent again. I slowly unfolded another paper in my hand and looked directly at her. "Vanessa, your father promised a venue payment 3 different times and failed every single time. Rachel called me yesterday morning because the wedding was hours away from cancellation." I held up the document slightly. "That wire transfer came from my account at 9:14 a.m. Every eye in the room immediately shifted toward Vanessa's father. The man looked furious now, but not at me, at being exposed. "This is inappropriate," he snapped suddenly while standing for his chair. "A wedding reception isn't the place for financial discussions." "No," I replied firmly, "but maybe it is a place to discuss publicly humiliating the woman who quietly paid for your daughter's fairy tale." A few guests actually nodded. I noticed several people at nearby tables beginning to piece things together. The awkward comments, Helen sitting alone all evening, the way Vanessa excluded her throughout the event. Suddenly the atmosphere changed. Guests who once admired Vanessa now looked uncomfortable around her. Daniel finally stood up then. "Dad, please," he whispered, clearly panicking. "Can we not do this here?" I turned toward my son slowly. And honestly, that moment hurt more than confronting Vanessa ever did. Because even now, after everything his mother endured, he still seemed more worried about the wedding atmosphere than her pain. "Do what exactly?" I asked him quietly. "Tell the truth." Daniel opened his mouth, but couldn't answer. I could see the conflict all over his face. Embarrassment, guilt, fear, confusion. Deep down, I think he knew I was right. But he had spent so long trying to keep Vanessa happy that he no longer knew how to stand up to her. Vanessa suddenly stepped forward again, this time sounding defensive instead of nervous. "I never meant to hurt Helen," she insisted quickly. "Things were stressful. Emotions were high." "You called her embarrassing," I said flatly. She froze. "And worse," I continued, my voice still calm, "you made her believe it." Helen immediately looked down again, ashamed by the attention. Even after all this, she still wanted the humiliation to end quietly. That's what people like Vanessa never understand about women like my wife. Kindness is not weakness. Helen wasn't quiet because she lacked strength. She stayed quiet because she loved her family more than her pride. Vanessa's mother finally stood up too, clearly desperate to rescue the situation. "This has become extremely dramatic," she said coldly. "Surely mature adults can discuss these things privately." I looked directly at her. Was humiliating my wife private? I asked. She said nothing. The silence that followed was brutal. Then, from somewhere near the back of the ballroom, one of the older guests quietly started clapping. Just once. Then another person joined. Then another. Within seconds, scattered applause spread across the room. Not loud celebratory applause, but respectful applause. Supportive applause. People weren't clapping because of money. They were clapping because they finally understood who Helen really was and how unfairly she'd been treated all day. Helen looked completely overwhelmed. Vanessa looked devastated. And Daniel looked ashamed. I stepped down from the stage slowly after that, fully expecting the reception to collapse into chaos. But before I could return to my seat, something unexpected happened. Daniel walked directly toward his mother, not Vanessa, his mother. The entire ballroom watched silently as my son stopped in front of Helen with tears in his eyes. For a moment, he couldn't even speak. Then he knelt beside her chair and quietly said the words he should have said long before this wedding ever started. "Mom, I'm sorry." The entire ballroom remained silent as Daniel knelt beside his mother's chair with tears filling his eyes. In all my years as a father, I had never seen my son look so broken. The confident groom who had smiled through the ceremony only an hour earlier was gone, replaced by a man finally realizing the damage his silence had caused. Helen immediately reached for his face the way mothers instinctively do when their children are hurting, even though she was the one who had been humiliated all day. That's who she was. Even heartbroken, her first instinct was still love. Daniel struggled to speak at first, his voice shaking under the weight of guilt, while hundreds of guests watched quietly around us. "Mom, I should have stopped it," he whispered. "I saw things happening, and I kept telling myself it would get better. I thought if I stayed quiet, everyone would eventually get along. But I failed you." Helen started crying harder hearing those words because, deep down, that acknowledgement was all she had wanted from him. Not revenge, not public humiliation, just for her son to see her pain and stand beside her. Vanessa remained near the stage completely frozen, looking like she no longer recognized the situation slipping out her control. Her bridesmaids whispered nervously beside her, while guests throughout the ballroom openly stared at her family, now instead of admiring them. The carefully crafted image of elegance and perfection she spent months building had shattered in less than 10 minutes. But the real turning point came when Daniel slowly stood back up and turned toward his wife. You could feel the tension immediately spread to the room again, because everyone understood something serious was about to happen. Daniel looked at Vanessa silently for several seconds before finally speaking in a calm but painful voice. "Did you really think my mother embarrassed me?" Vanessa looked stunned by the direct question. She tried forcing a soft smile and reached for his hand, but he stepped back before she could touch him. "Daniel, please, not here," she whispered nervously, glancing at the guests surrounding them. But Daniel wasn't looking at the crowd anymore. For the first time that entire day, he looked completely focused on the truth. "You excluded her from photos," he continued quietly. "You mocked the way she dresses. You told people she didn't fit the atmosphere. And when she heard you call her embarrassing, his voice cracked slightly. You didn't even apologize properly." Vanessa's face tightened as she realized there was no easy way out anymore. "I was stressed," she said defensively. "Everything was overwhelming, and I said things badly." But Daniel shook his head slowly. "No," he replied. "Stress doesn't create cruelty. It reveals it." The room became completely silent again after that sentence because everyone knew he was right. People don't accidentally humiliate others repeatedly. Those actions come from somewhere deeper. Vanessa's father suddenly stepped forward angrily, clearly desperate to regain control before the situation became even worse. "Enough!" he snapped loudly. "This entire night has turned into a circus over hurt feelings. The second he said those words, I saw several guests visibly react with disgust, because now everyone finally understood exactly where Vanessa learned her arrogance from. Daniel slowly turned toward him with disappointment written all over his face. Hurt feelings, he repeated quietly. My mother spent years sacrificing everything for me while all of you treated her like she was beneath you. Vanessa's father opened his mouth to argue again, but Daniel cut him off before he could speak. And the worst part is, she still tried being kind to all of us anyway. Helen covered her face, crying softly, while several guests nearby comforted her gently. Women who barely spoke to her earlier suddenly sat beside her offering tissues and kind words after realizing how unfairly she had been treated throughout the wedding. Meanwhile, Vanessa stood completely isolated near the dance floor, no longer surrounded by admiration or attention. Even her bridesmaids looked uncomfortable standing beside her now. The atmosphere inside the ballroom had changed entirely. The expensive decorations, luxury champagne, and glamorous music no longer mattered because the truth had stripped away all the performance underneath it. Then Daniel did something nobody expected. He walked to the center of the ballroom, removed his wedding ring slowly, and placed it carefully on the table beside Vanessa's untouched champagne glass. Gasps spread across the room instantly. Vanessa stared at the ring like she couldn't process what she was seeing. Daniel, she whispered in panic. But my son looked emotionally exhausted now, like someone finally waking up after ignoring reality for too long. I spent months convincing myself that keeping peace was the same thing as protecting people, he said quietly. But all I really did was allow the person I love most to get hurt over and over again. He glanced toward Helen. And if someone can humiliate my mother this easily before marriage, he looked back at Vanessa with heartbreaking disappointment in his eyes. What happens after? The ballroom felt completely frozen as everyone waited for Vanessa to respond. But for once, she had nothing left to say. For a long moment after Daniel placed the wedding ring on the table, nobody in the ballroom even seemed to breathe. The orchestra had stopped playing completely. Waiters stood frozen beside tables holding untouched champagne bottles, and every guest stared at the center of the room, watching a marriage collapse only hours after the ceremony ended. Vanessa looked pale with shock, her entire body tense, as though she still believed this was some temporary emotional outburst Daniel would eventually calm down from. But I knew my son well enough to recognize the look on his face. This wasn't anger anymore. It was clarity, the kind that only comes after someone finally sees the truth they spent too long avoiding. Daniel, don't do this, Vanessa whispered desperately while stepping closer to him. You're emotional right now. Your father manipulated this entire situation. I almost laughed hearing that because even now, instead of reflecting on her own behavior, she needed someone else to blame. Daniel shook his head slowly. No, he replied quietly. Dad didn't manipulate anything. He just finally said out loud what everyone else was too afraid to admit. Vanessa's eyes immediately filled with tears, but they didn't look like tears of guilt. They looked like panic. The kind people cry when they realize control is slipping away from them publicly. Her mother rushed forward next, speaking in the calm, fake voice wealthy families often use when trying to hide embarrassment. Daniel, she said carefully, every couple faces stress during weddings. You don't throw away a marriage over misunderstandings. Daniel looked emotionally drained as he answered her. This wasn't a misunderstanding. My mother was humiliated repeatedly, and I let it happen. Then he glanced around the ballroom at all the guests silently watching. Honestly, I think part of me knew it was wrong from the beginning. I just kept convincing myself it would stop. His voice cracked slightly. But people don't suddenly become kinder after marriage. Those words hit the room hard because everyone understood exactly what he meant. Vanessa finally lost control completely then. Oh, please, she snapped bitterly, tears running down her face now. Why is everyone acting like Helen is some innocent victim? She's overly emotional. She inserts herself into everything. And honestly, she makes people uncomfortable sometimes. The second those words left her mouth, several guests visibly recoiled in shock because instead of apologizing, she had just confirmed everything I exposed earlier. Even worse, she said it while Helen sat only a few feet away, silently crying. Daniel stared at his wife in disbelief. You still don't understand, he said softly. Vanessa looked around desperately hoping someone would support her, but the atmosphere had completely changed. The same guests who admired her elegance earlier now looked disturbed by her cruelty. Even some of her own friends avoided eye contact. One older woman near the front quietly shook her head in disappointment before whispering something to her husband. The illusion was gone. People finally saw the truth underneath the expensive dresses and perfect photographs. Then something happened that surprised even me. Helen slowly stood up. Despite her tears and emotional exhaustion, she walked calmly toward Vanessa with more grace than anyone else in that ballroom deserved. I honestly thought she might comfort her, because that's the kind of heart my wife has. But instead, Helen stopped a few feet away and spoke softly enough that the entire silent room still heard every word. "I spent months blaming myself," she admitted quietly. "I kept thinking maybe if I dressed differently, spoke differently, or stayed quieter, you might finally accept me." Vanessa looked stunned hearing Helen speak so directly. "But today I realized something important," Helen continued gently. "Kind people shouldn't have to earn basic respect." Several guests nodded immediately while listening. Helen wiped tears from her face before adding, "And love without kindness eventually becomes cruelty." The ballroom fell silent again after that sentence. Even Vanessa looked shaken now, because deep down she probably knew Helen was right. Daniel walked over beside his mother then, standing next to her instead of beside his wife for the first time all day. The symbolism of that moment wasn't lost on anyone. Vanessa saw it too. Her shoulders slowly dropped as reality finally settled over her face. This wasn't something she could charm her way out of anymore. The image she spent years building, the perfect, sophisticated woman marrying into a beautiful future, had collapsed in front of hundreds of people because she underestimated the quiet strength of the woman she mocked. Vanessa's father angrily grabbed his suit jacket and muttered something about this family being insane before storming toward the exit with his wife, following behind him in humiliation. Several of their business associates quietly left soon after, clearly uncomfortable staying any longer. One by one, guests began gathering their belongings while whispers spread across the ballroom about what had happened. The fairy tale reception was falling apart in real time, and strangely enough, it was the first honest moment of the entire wedding. By the end of the night, the ballroom that once looked like a luxury fairy tale felt almost empty. Half-finished champagne glasses had abandoned on tables, expensive flower arrangements drooped under dimming lights, and waiters quietly cleaned around guests who slipped out awkwardly after witnessing the collapse of marriage only hours after the ceremony. But strangely, for the first time that entire day, Helen finally looked peaceful, exhausted, emotional, overwhelmed. Yes, but peaceful too, because the truth was no longer hidden. She no longer had to sit quietly pretending cruelty didn't hurt her. Everyone had finally seen who she truly was, and more importantly, Daniel had seen it too. We left the reception long after most guests were gone. Daniel walked beside his mother through the vineyard in complete silence, while cool night air moved through the rows of grapes surrounding the property. I stayed slightly behind them for a moment, watching my son hold Helen's hand the same way he used to when he was little. It honestly broke my heart realizing how close he came to losing himself, completely trying to fit into Vanessa's world. Eventually, Daniel stopped walking and turned toward us with tears still sitting in his eyes. "I don't know how I let things get this far," he admitted quietly. Helen immediately tried comforting him, but this time he shook his head. "No, Mom, please don't protect me from this. I should have defended you the very first time she disrespected you." His voice cracked again as guilt overwhelmed him. "Instead, I kept asking you to tolerate it because I was afraid of conflict." I could hear the disappointment he felt toward himself more than anything else. That night, Daniel didn't return to the luxury honeymoon suite booked for him and Vanessa. Instead, he came back to our hotel and sat with us until nearly sunrise, talking honestly for the first time in months. He admitted there had been warning signs long before the wedding. Arguments about class, status, appearances, and even how often he should visit us after marriage. Vanessa constantly criticized ordinary people, mocked emotional vulnerability, and cared deeply about how relationships looked to outsiders instead of how they actually felt privately. Daniel confessed he ignored those signs because he convinced himself love meant compromise. But somewhere along the way, compromise turned into silence, and silence turned into betrayal toward the people who loved him most. A few days later, the story spread online after several guests posted vague details about the dramatic reception. Some versions exaggerated things wildly, but one detail remained consistent everywhere. The groom's father publicly exposed that he secretly funded the wedding after the bride insulted the groom's mother. Ironically, the same social media image Vanessa spent months carefully building became the thing that destroyed her reputation overnight. People who once admired her glamorous lifestyle suddenly criticized her arrogance and cruelty instead. Daniel later told me she tried contacting him repeatedly after the wedding, first angrily, then emotionally, then desperately. But by then, something inside him had changed permanently. Once someone finally sees the truth clearly, it becomes impossible to unsee it. As for Helen, she spent weeks afterwards struggling emotionally despite everything. Public humiliation leaves scars, even when people eventually defend you. There were nights she quietly asked me whether the entire situation was somehow her fault. That's the tragedy of kind people. They often blame themselves for cruelty of others. But slowly, something beautiful started happening. Daniel began visiting constantly, not out of guilt alone, but because he genuinely wanted to rebuild a relationship he nearly damaged forever. He started taking Helen to breakfast every Sunday morning, helping around our house without being asked, and spending hours simply talking with her again like they used to before the wedding chaos consumed everything. Little by little, I watched my wife's confidence return. About 6 months later, Daniel officially finalized the annulment. He told us signing those papers felt less like losing a marriage and more like waking up from a life that never should have happened. He also started therapy shortly afterward because he wanted to understand why he became so willing to ignore unhealthy behavior just to avoid confrontation. Honestly, hearing my son say that made me proud of him again. Growth begins the moment someone stops making excuses for themselves. One evening nearly a year after the wedding disaster, the three of us sat together on our back porch watching the sunset while Helen laughed at something Daniel said. It was one of those quiet family moments that money can't buy and status can't imitate. Daniel suddenly looked at his mother and said softly, "You know, that wedding falling apart probably saved my life." Helen smiled sadly before touching his hand. "No," she replied gently. "The truth saved your life." And sitting there beside the woman I loved, watching my son finally understand what truly matters in life, I realized something important too. Respect means nothing when it's based on money, appearances, or social status. Real respect is how you treat the people who love you when they have nothing to offer except their heart.